Good evening. Welcome to the Roberts and Genis Live program. This time for August 3rd, Wednesday in the year of our Lord 2022. So glad you could be with us. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, Scripture, the church, the fathers, the medievals, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, the saints, the doctors, the theologians, and just about anything I could find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And usually at the top of the program, we have a special topic that we want to cover, and tonight is no exception. Tonight I have with me our special guest, Mr. John Salza, attorney at law and wonderful Catholic apologist, scripture scholar, you name it, the list goes on and on with John Salza. Let's bring John aboard. John, my producer, and introduce him to the crowd. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Good. Thank you. Any kind words you want to say to us to start us off here before we get started?
Which John are you referring to, Robert?
You. I'm referring to you, John, on the program.
Got it. It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, you and I have been friends for a long time. I think we go back 20 plus years. And certainly a lot of your earlier works, Robert, were influential on me in terms of scripture and apologetics. So you were an influence on me in those early years, and I've persevered. You told me a long time ago, you want to enter this fray, you know, you're going to get beat up a little bit, but you told me, and again, you probably remember the conversation, you know, follow the truth and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah.
That's really what has happened with respect to this topic. For me, I never expected to be sitting here talking about this, but that's exactly what I did.
Yeah. John, I'm so proud of you. I don't have the words to express it. We've been watching each other from afar in the past, decade or so, and we've gone off in different directions, but we do basically the same work. And every once in a while, your name will pop up on my email list, or somebody's talking about you, and I'm sure the same thing happens to you about me. But this is one occasion where we've come together and joined heads because of the importance of this topic. And wow, it couldn't come at a more crucial time as far as I'm concerned, because we have another pope who is upsetting a lot of people. Excuse my phone ringing. And we have a lot of good people who are called traditionalists, who love the Lord, they love their Catholic faith, they want the truth, they want to do right. That's all they think about all day long, as you and I probably do. And it's really a shame that we've come to this point where things are so divisive now that everybody's on a hot wire, and it's feelings get hurt and emotions come out, and sometimes you don't know whether the person you're speaking to is being rational or not because of those things that churn inside of us and try to find their way out to express our opinion about our most precious thing to us, our faith. So it's not an easy thing. And it was suggested to me to have you on the program, and as soon as I heard it, I go, oh yeah, no question. But like you said, I didn't think about where the chips were going to fall. I mean, I just said, yes, let's have John explain his position, because this is monumental. When you have somebody of your caliber who up and leaves a society he's been with, for how many years, John?
15
years. And I have to admit, when I saw you go in there 15 years ago, I didn't know all what to make of it. And I don't know. I guess I just kept on doing what I was doing, and let the chips fall as they may, as you say, you know. And so it's pretty volatile. And I don't know how much we're going to accomplish tonight, but we're going to try to accomplish as much as we can. And I think the sole purpose for you here is to educate people to what you have learned. And there's some people out there who think you've already learned it and somehow you kept putting it off, kept putting it off. And I told them, I said, look, I think what it is the cumulative effect of discovering all these things. And all of a sudden, the light bulb goes off in our head and we go, oh my gosh, what have I done? Where am I going? Blah, blah, blah. And you never know when that's coming. It's just the way our minds work. It's the way the environment is around us, the way the people talk to us. And all of a sudden, bang, now you know the truth. Who knows how that comes to us? I'm sure it's a little by little process. Sometimes it comes like a lightning bolt. Who knows? God works in strange ways for people. So, let me get into it a little bit with you. Um, and don't take too long, but don't be too short. Okay, explain yourself fully so that everybody has a good grasp of where you're coming from, because there may be somebody out there, as I suspect, who don't know you and wonder what all this SSPP what is about. So
Yes.
consider those people too. And let me just start you off with a question, perhaps like, when you joined the SSPX 15 years ago, what were your sentiments? That is, what was it that drew you to them? Because I've heard you say it was more like a logistical thing, and you just happened to fall into worshiping with them, and then all of a sudden you found yourself in the society. Tell us a little bit about that first step.
You don't technically join the SSPX because it's a priestly fraternity. I'm a layman who attend their masses on Sunday, right? So I was there for the liturgy. And the reason I began going there is because I had relocated, to a rural area, which brought me 12 minutes away from the society chapel. Prior to that, I had been attending the diocesan traditional Latin Mass for 3 years. So, they can poke fun at it, but it was a geographical consideration, I think, above all. I never, in principle, was looking at all of the doctrinal canonical issues. I wanted the liturgy. I wanted the old traditional Mass. I am a traditional Catholic, and I'd like to preface this discussion by reinforcing that to my tratty friends out there. I do exclusively attend the TLM. I have the opportunity to attend it both at the ICK, the Institute of Christ the King, as well as a diocesan Latin Mass in St. Mary's Elm Grove. So I'm very fortunate to have that. I hold to the traditional theology. I do recognize that there are some problems with the council, some ambiguous statements. I acknowledge that there has been a liturgical revolution in the church, that the Novus Ordo has not been implemented, I don't think, the way the council fathers wanted it. I can go on and on and on about my traditional views, but it ultimately became a question of where we can't divorce the faith from authority. Otherwise, we become Protestant. That was the ultimate issue for me, divorcing what traditionalists call Catholic tradition from authority. They don't exist independently of each other. And I could briefly explain what my journey was, Robert, because I didn't expect this, but it started 15 years ago when I began researching Sedevacantism. And I co-authored a book with Robert Sisko called True or False Pope, which came out about 5 years ago.
By the way, somebody wanted me to mention to you, you have a second edition of that book out now, right?
We're working on the second edition. Fortunately, we just released, this is an extensive 800 plus page book that sold for $45. You can get it now on Kindle for $9.99. So we wanted to make that available, but we are working on a second edition, which is another 500 pages. But my point in bringing that up was that the foundations for my conclusion today really are in that book, the theology of the church with respect to marks of the church, the attributes, necessity of canonical mission, jurisdiction, etc. All of those things. When we completed that book, Mr. Sisko and I, we came to the conclusion that, the ecclesiology that we just presented to refute the Sedevacantists actually also applies to the society. it was interesting that we kind of came to those conclusions independently, but then started doing our own research. And where I started after being suspicious about whether this really applied to the society, I first started with the correspondence between Archbishop Lefebvre and Cardinal Ratzinger right before the illicit consecrations.
John, I hate to interrupt you, but
yes,
for the new listeners or the people that aren't familiar with this, tell them what the SSPX is, who the leader was, how he got started, and
okay,
then tell us a little bit about how this developed into a controversy. That would be good.
sure. That's good. That's good, Robert. Yeah, Archbishop Lefebvre, and this in no way is intended to attack him or denigrate him, although I will prove that he held to many errors, which is ultimately how I came to this conclusion. But he was a wonderful missionary bishop. He was present at the council. He did great missionary work in Africa. To make a long story short, he was approached by seminarians who were upset with the liturgical reforms and asked him to form a seminary to help these young men to become traditional priests. And so he formed what's called the Society of St. Pius X in 1970. The Bishop of Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, at the time, Bishop Charrier, approved the Society of St. Pius X as a pious union, it's called, under the 17 Code, which is really a lay association because it was a group of seminarians that were being formed into priests. They were properly erected canonically, but only on an experimental basis. They were erected for a 6-year period, at which time, if the Holy See didn't renew it, they would have been completely expired. And Archbishop,
I'm a little confused. Let me interrupt you here, because before you said it was a priestly thing, and now you're saying it's a lay thing. So which is it?
They themselves call themselves a priestly association, but technically, canonically, under the 17 Code, their decree of canonical formation calls it a pious union and not a priestly society. Under the 17 Code, you could be a pious union, which is a lay association that didn't have juridic personality, or you could be a society of common life, which would be a religious or priestly society, which would be a canonical person under the code. Their decree from the bishop, as well as their statutes, say that they are only a pious association or a pious union or a lay association. So that's how they were elected. The decree from the local bishop was all that is required under the 17 Code because it was only a pious union. Okay. And that's why, Robert, because it was only a pious union and not a common society of common life, the bishop could both erect it and suppress it without intervention from the Holy See. Their statutes even say that they were completely dependent upon the local bishop. And the seminarians that we are being formed under Archbishop Lefebvre were to be incarnated into the dioceses, never into the Society of St. Pius X, because, number one, the SSPX is not a juridic person capable of receiving priests through incarnation. And number two, because Archbishop Lefebvre didn't have ordinary jurisdiction over these seminarians. They were still the subjects of the local bishop. Archbishop Lefebvre was forming them in the traditional rites, but this was not a canonical entity that could incarnate these men, nor could Archbishop Lefebvre exercise ordinary jurisdiction over them.
From your experience, do the members of the society understand what you just said? Do they go by it, or is it just sort of shoved under the rug?
What they say, well, they can't deny what I'm saying because this is part of both the bishop's decree and their own statutes. What they will say, and this is irrelevant to the ultimate conclusion, but what they will say is the original bishop's decree was an error. Of course, everybody makes errors in their view, and their error was that they should have been called a society of common life and not a pious union. They make that argument to take the position that the bishop's suppression was unlawful because under the 17 Code, a society of common life had to be suppressed by the apostolic see. The bishop alone couldn't do that. The reason, Robert, why I say it's completely irrelevant is because the Holy See did suppress the Society of St. Pius X in 1975, and that suppression was approved in forma specifica by Paul VI himself, who made the act of suppression his own. So it is irrelevant whether the society was a pious union or a lay association or a common society or a personal prelature. It's irrelevant. They were erected on an experimental basis. Even if the society weren't suppressed, they would have expired juridically in 1976. The fact, though, is they were suppressed by the Pope a year earlier, and hence are not on the canonical map of the Roman Catholic Church.
I see. So the bishops calling them one of two things really wouldn't matter, as you say, because the Pope got into the act, made the final decision, and it doesn't matter what transpired prior to that, basically. So
it doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah. It's almost as if, you know, they're trying to poison the well. You see this commonly in their writings. They attempt to poison the well, which is a tactic, but nevertheless a tactic that fails here because the supreme authority is the one who suppressed the Society of St. Pius X, 1975, from whose judgment there is no appeal, period.
Now, I don't want to get into dirty water here, but it seems to me that your attitude, your sentiment here is one wherein the society is deliberately undermining the Vatican or deliberately trying to throw nails in the road to flatten their tires or whatever they can do to sort of advance their agenda, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Do you see that in them? And is that what got you scared about where they're going?
As I began to study the positions of Archbishop Lefebvre in the society, I began to see that there are a lot of misrepresentations of what the church teaches, what canon law says, and a lot of fallacious arguments. Now, I've written a dozen articles on this in the last 6 months proving this, so I don't need to get into all the details, but it is a case, I believe, of attempting to justify one's existence outside of the structure of the Catholic Church. And you've seen this too, Robert, and this isn't to impute culpability to every individual clergyman or person who adheres to the society. I'm speaking in general terms. In general terms, when one is separated from the church, which the society is, they often begin to attack the church and justify their position in a way that's not Catholic, in a way that's not in accord with what her perennial, tradition has been. So that's what I came to discover.
Let's go back to this issue you raised about doctrine versus the structure, doctrine versus authority, or belief versus authority. That is a split that I don't think anybody has ever had a good answer to, no matter whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, or whatever. There comes a time where you disagree on how things are practiced or how things are believed, and you think the guys on the other side are heretics, and so now what do? Your options are limited. So can you elaborate on that from your perspective? I know it's calling on you for a judgment because you're just basically taking care of John Salza right now, and you're doing the best for John Salza. You may not be able to do the best for somebody else who is in that situation, but I'm sure you've had some thoughts along those lines, and I'd love to hear them, and I think everybody else would too.
Well, I'll give you my perspective, Robert, and hopefully it may resonate with some people. What we're talking about here is divine law. We're talking about our Lord Jesus Christ, who has established his church. And the church has been established in a hierarchical juridical structure with authority. That authority, and this is what makes us Catholics, not Protestants, that authority is the authority of Jesus Christ coming through the Pope and the bishops in the form of jurisdiction. This is what puts us in subjection to our bishop and to the Roman pontiff. What did Boniface VIII say? This is why I say this is a matter of divine law. I know a lot of the questioners say, good, we got another lawyer here talking about canon law. No, canon law regulates these matters, but we're fundamentally talking about the divine law. Boniface VIII, among many other popes, declared that it is absolutely necessary for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff for salvation. Now, what does to be subject mean? It doesn't simply mean that we mention the Pope in the canon of the Mass and pray for his intentions in the Rosary. being subject puts us in a hierarchical relationship or legal relationship with the bishop and the Roman pontiff. It's a superior and inferior relationship, which is represented by jurisdiction. If I am subject to the jurisdiction of my local bishop, I am automatically subject to the Roman pontiff. You see, as a matter of divine law, again, the law of Christ and his authority comes through the clergy, the primacy and the episcopacy through jurisdiction. This is what makes us Catholic. This is how we identify the Catholic Church. This is a mark of the Catholic Church. This is what apostolicity means. We say we're one holy Catholic apostolic. Apostolicity refers to the formal apostolic succession, which is not merely the material laying on of hands, but the jurisdiction that comes from Christ through the Pope to the bishops to whom he gives canonical mission. And that's where the rubber meets the road for me, and it should for any Catholic. If the society is not subject to the Roman pontiff, and they're clearly not because they're not subject to their local bishop, this is a question of not only their canonical position in the church, but their own salvation, and certainly the salvation of those who would formally and willfully adhere to the movement. See, so this is really ultimately the primary, the salvific consideration for me, among many other things, but that was the ultimate issue.
I find that a lot of people in general don't really understand the legal dimension of structures. They enjoy the structure in the sense that, hey, we got a bishop, we got a pope, we have a priest we can go confess our sins to and go to mass and sing songs and blah, blah, blah. But the legal aspect is what holds it together without them even thinking about it, you know, if we didn't have that legal structure. So this brings up the question, because I've heard this back and forth on both sides of the issue. And that is, well, the society does subject itself to the Pope. Like, I think Bishop Fillet had said that. And then you get a guy like Bishop Williamson, who's, well, no, we really don't subject ourselves to the Pope. We're, very separate from him. And then you get everywhere in between on those two diverse opinions. So from your perspective, what do you think is the proper answer to all that?
The canonists all give that answer, Robert. You know what they say subjecting to the Roman pontiff means? It means being subject to your local bishop. That's what it means. The fact of the matter is the society operates contrary to the permission and will of the bishops, and they even admit they do. I mean, in the latest crisis series, one priest after another says, yep, we are operating against the express will and permission of the princes of the church. So because they're not subject to the local bishop, they are not subject to the Roman pontiff. And you're familiar with the early patristics, with Cyril of Alexandria and Irenaeus. I mean, they all talked about the bishop, the local bishop. In fact, the earliest liturgies were celebrated with the bishop. That was the center where the faith gathered. And again, it starts there. Now you become subject to your bishop if you're a parishioner in a diocesan church, right? That's under his ordinary jurisdiction. But as you said, they say this is legalese. Well, Christ is the supreme lawgiver and judge. This is how he set up his church. And it is really the legal structure, and I said the jurisdiction of the church, that distinguishes her from all of the other so-called Christian religions. That's what makes us Catholic. That's how we know the Roman Catholic Church is Christ's church.
So let's get back to this question about doctrine versus hierarchy, or faith versus the legal structure. How is one to cope with a bishop that is clearly a modernist, clearly a liberal, and a pope above him who is the same and tells us, in one way or another every day of the week?
Yeah.
So let's get down to where the rubber meets the road here. How is a typical SSPX member, or whatever you call them, I don't even know what you call them from what you're saying, how do they cope with this? What do you do?
Well, in practice, how much influence does the Pope have in one's daily life? How much influence even does the bishop have in one's daily life? I mean, that would be my question. We certainly can't contravene the divine law, which requires us to be under their jurisdiction and in submission to them. And so the next question becomes, Is my bishop or even my parish priest commanding something that's not within the scope of his authority? Number one. If he is, I don't have to listen to it. If he is commanding something within the scope of his authority, then we obey, unless it is a commandment to commit sin. That's really how Catholics have always viewed the question of obedience, right? If it's in the scope of his authority, which means there's not a higher law that trumps what he's commanding, then we must submit to it. Even if we perceive it to be unjust, the road of the saints has always been submission to the authority. And so practically, what does that mean for us? Do the best you can. Find the best mass you can. But the solution is not outside of the church. It's in the church. We must stay in the church.
Yeah, I've always said that to them whenever they've approached me about joining, or I said, look, man, I've decided there is a fight going on. That is for sure. And it's getting worse by the minute. But you're not going to do anybody any good by peering in the windows at what's going on inside the church. You need to be inside that structure. And as I said the other night on our show, if we had the muscle of the SSPX theologians, the members that go to the church, the seminaries, and they all came into the church, can you imagine what kind of battle we would put up against these modernists?
It'd be wonderful. And that's been my aim, Robert. I've said this many times. My goal isn't the destruction of the society. I'm trying to share what I've learned. And one of the things I've learned, and I was conditioned to believe, as many are, that Archbishop Lefebvre was this champion of orthodoxy. He was not. He held to many errors that I will go through. Some of these errors even qualify as heresies. And I'm not meaning to denigrate him. I'm just saying objectively, some of the positions he held were wrong. Not all of them, of course, and he did a lot of good.
Give us 3 or 4 or 5 of those. We need to know those.
Archbishop Lefebvre, for example, said that jurisdiction comes from the people. Read the letter he wrote to his patrons a month before he died. He said, because people have a right to the sacraments, they effectively confer jurisdiction upon the society bishops. That is a heresy. His own patron, St. Pious X, in his catechism said, anyone who says that the jurisdiction comes from the people, it's a heresy. I mean, that's just one of them. He called the Roman Catholic. Yeah.
Know that? I mean, let's stop right there for a second.
Sure they do. Sure they do. It's on their website. I got a lot of this information off their websites.
Off their website.
Absolutely.
So who is of caliber to see this as a heresy, call it out in the SSPX, and let the chips fall as they may? Is there anybody that could do that? Or are they just all of one mind and, whatever's for the society, that's all we take?
Well, I can't speculate on what they see or do. All I can do is put this work out there on my website and hopefully that it gains some attention. But we'll have this all out there. Much of this I already have out there. This letter was written in February of 1991, and the Archbishop specifically says jurisdiction comes from the people. That's
you must know, I've been there for 15 years, some men of high caliber, some priests in the SSPX who could look at this and say, wow, we got a problem here.
I visited the seminary. I know seminarians who are now priests. What I perceive has been the issue is that they're not seeing what the church teaches outside of the milieu of the SSPX. And many of these priests do view Archbishop Lefebvre as their rule of faith. If you watch their recent crisis series, they called it, almost every time the priest would ultimately say, this is what Archbishop Lefebvre held. It almost appears to me that they recognize there might be a blind spot somewhere in their positions, and they fill that blind spot in by deferring to Archbishop Lefebvre. I'm trying to remove that blind spot and fill it in with what the Roman Catholic Church actually teaches. This is what is going to help people discover that the Archbishop did hold some erroneous and damaging positions, and those positions have had a ripple effect today, Robert. They still are affecting this traditional movement. Many traditional Catholics unknowingly hold these positions that originated with Archbishop Lefebvre, like whether the Novus Ordo sacraments are dubious or whether Vatican II teaches heresy, and you know all the rest of it. A lot of those issues and errors came with Lefebvre. I mean, the only error in the traditional movement that I don't think came from Lefebvre is Feeneyism. because he wasn't a Feniate, but almost every other error that at least I'm aware of came from Lefebvre. That's a fact.
Wow. Well, John, I think you hit the nail on the head there, because I see this in a lot of Catholic groups. Let's take, Opus Dei, for example, Jose Maria Escriva. Not the best gentleman you want to know, but yet
Right.
he's a saint, and he had some pretty, severe, let's say, ideas about how to run his, and they're still abiding by what he said today, and
Yeah.
he's basically the authority. The same with Father Maciel. You know all about Father Maciel.
Yeah.
Wow, if there was ever a wretch that we found out, it's him. And yet these guys bow down to him as if he's from God, right from God,
Yeah.
directly from God, And I see this in a lot of Catholic groups. And that's why I've never joined one of those groups, because
Mhm.
I'm always afraid of the guy at the top, what he's
Yeah.
going to be dictating, what he's going to be saying. And if you want to stay in the group, and I know what the pressure they put on you. It's like, well, look, Bob, either you obey what Father so and so says, or you're out of here. Basically, is what they might not say it so gruffly. They'll say it
Right.
very politely, but they'll still say it. And I'm sure that's what happens in the SSPX. If you don't go by what Archbishop Lefebvre, I
Yeah.
grew up saying Lefebvre, okay, so I'm going to continue.
Sure.
If you don't go by what he says, then you know your days are numbered, basically. So I can see there's a lot of pressure. Did you see that pressure there?
Oh, definitely. I saw constant and ultimate deferral to Archbishop Lefebvre. That's why I started researching what Lefebvre actually said,
Mhm.
because I got to only so far with the priests until they
I don't
said,
mean
look,
deferring to Archbishop Lefebvre. I meant pressure that you either conform or you're out of here. Did you see that much?
not as much because I'm a layman who attended the Mass for the liturgy. I
Okay.
can only imagine that pressure exists in the seminary among the seminarians. That's how they're formed. I've talked to them while they were seminarians. I still talk to some of them who are now SSPX priests. And there is a cult of personality around Archbishop Lefebvre. That's a danger in itself. But when you're deferring to one man and you have dogmatic decrees with accompanying anathemas from the Council of Trent concerning whoever says that you can exercise an episcopal ministry without being sent by canonical authority, let you be anathema, but Lefebvre is doing it anyway. That's a problem. That is a serious problem.
Wow.
So
So,
that's
so going
there's a
back to this whole thing about living my faith, and I'm against the hierarchy for all the malarkey they're doing. Because I don't know if we've settled this issue yet, because right now we're talking about all the follies and foibles of Archbishop Lefebvre, and yet on the other side of the fence, man, let's multiply that by 10 for all the malarkey that's going on in the Vatican today. So we got basically two sides now. And in the
yeah.
middle of that somehow is the Latin Mass, I find, because everybody is looking for consolation in the Latin Mass. And is that, I mean, for the typical layperson who's not in the hierarchy of the SSPX, who just goes to the Mass because you went to it for the same reason, because you love the
Yes.
Mass.
Yes.
Okay. Those people, apparently, from what you've discovered, they need to be educated now, because this is not just a matter of going to the Mass and feeling comfortable and you're close with God in the liturgy and that's it. We stop thinking about it. No, you can't do that anymore, can you?
You can't, because you can't reduce the Roman Catholic faith to the 1962 Missal. The Roman Catholic faith means that I have the juridical bonds of faith, worship, and governance, which means I'm in union with my local bishop, I'm in union with the Pope, I'm part of the legal structure of the church, and I'm being served by bishops that have a canonical mission from the Holy Father and priests who have been incarnated under bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. That's what makes me Catholic.
Yeah.
I
So
may
basically,
love the missal. I may love the missal, Robert, and I do. I attend the old mass exclusively, but that doesn't justify me to leave the structure of the church. I mean that's just counterintuitive and counterproductive to one's spiritual life.
yeah. So in a sense, well, not in a sense, in reality, one can be on the lower rungs of the SSPX membership and go to the mass and think that they're glorifying God by their participation in the Latin Mass, receiving communion or receiving confession prior to Mass.
Yeah.
And all the while, technically speaking, would you say they're not?
No, because the masses offered by the society priests are illicit, which means that the priests do not have faculties to say mass, and that's because they're not incarnated.
No, no. What I'm
Even
asking, no, what I'm asking you is this. I'm asking you the opposite. I'm
okay,
asking you is, um, considering that we have gross legal, canonical, jurisdictional problems with the SSPX, those that go to the Mass and receive confession and then to the Eucharist, have they worshiped God in your
oh,
understanding?
oh yes, of course they have worshipped
Okay.
God, and we want to be clear about this, and we want to be grateful to Pope Francis that, and you may be aware of this, Robert, Pope Francis delegated faculties to the society priests for confessions and provisionally for marriages with permission of the local bishop. So this is wonderful news.
Yeah.
The reason why Francis did this, if you talk to Archbishop Pozo, who was one of the point people that was trying to reconcile the society, Pope Francis did that because he was concerned for the salvation of these penitents.
Yeah.
Because as I've concluded, they weren't having their sins forgiven because they didn't have supplied jurisdiction. That's another
Right.
issue. But
Right.
the other issue is Francis did it as a step for reconciliation, just as Benedict XVI lifted the declared excommunications on the four bishops as a step toward reconciliation.
Okay.
At the same time, Benedict said their ministry is still illegitimate and illicit. They have no canonical status or mission in the church. But we've taken a step. Now the society has to take the step of coming back into communion with the church. You see, so
Yeah.
steps have been made. We're not there yet. Yes, the people have worshiped God, but as I've discovered, those masses don't satisfy the Sunday obligation. And the
Oh,
Ecclesia
okay.
Dei replies,
Now you're
they've
getting now
been
you're getting to the legal part of it now. See,
it's it's
this gets really a sticky wicket here.
Well, the divine law requires us to fulfill the Sunday obligation. Ecclesiastical law says we do that by attending a mass under Canon 1248, which is sufficient to satisfy the obligation. Okay, the Vatican has said in its universal replies from Ecclesia Dei, as well as the Canon 1248 that I cited, that one must be a church, lawfully established church, sui juris is the technical term, in full communion in order for the mass to qualify for the obligation. Traditional Catholics are under the impression that it's only a valid missal that makes the Sunday obligation filled. It's not true. The Sunday obligation is tied to the church in which the Mass is celebrated.
Okay.
When the Canon 1248 uses the term Catholic rite, it is referring to a Catholic church sui juris in which a valid liturgical rite is celebrated.
Okay. You made that
Because,
pretty clear.
yeah,
Now
yeah.
let me try to stick a wedge in there to play devil's advocate with you. So my question was, do they worship God? And your answer was yes. But then we got to the legal part, and you have to worship God under the legal jurisdiction of the church under what, Canon 1248 was it? So in that sense, you're not worshiping God. So which is it?
I said they're worshiping God, but they're not satisfying his divine law of making the day holy, the Sunday obligation. They can be worshiping God, but not meeting a requirement that God has for that worship.
Oh, okay. When I said worshiping God, I meant worshiping under our Sunday obligation. Maybe I should have made
Okay,
that clear.
okay.
So
I
if I
re-
rephrase it that way, you would say no?
if by worshiping God you mean satisfying the Sunday obligation, I would say no,
Yeah. Okay.
because it doesn't satisfy Canon 1248, the SSPX masses.
Okay. And you say that with full confidence. No
Absolutely.
hesitation.
No hesitation. I've got all the Ecclesia Dei replies that say the same thing. and all of the commentaries, and even going back before the 83 code, you go into the 1970 code, canonists have always said that the Sunday obligation is tied to a Catholic church that's under the bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, if a priest decided to break off from his bishop and start saying Mass, whether it's in his garage or a beautiful chapel, wouldn't Catholics know that, wait a minute, that probably doesn't fulfill my obligation? Why would that be? Because he broke away from his bishop. He's no longer incarnated. The society clergy are in the same position. They're not incarnated under a bishop either. Now, it appears different because they're a worldwide consortium of priests who wear cassocks and preach good sermons and have all the smells and bells. But the reality is, under Canon 265, a priest cannot exercise any of his faculties unless he's incarnated. And again, under that Canon 1248, you got to have Mass in a Catholic church. And the SSPX chapels are not considered Catholic churches.
This just brings to the fore what a scary proposition it is to be a Christian. I mean, just think of it. You have all these seminaries, SSPX seminaries, all over the world. How many are there? Seminaries?
Well, I don't know how many. I think 4, and I think the priests are in excess of 600, almost approaching 700. That's why what you said, Robert, what an incredible good they could do for the church.
Yeah.
If even a large segment of the clergy would come in and integrate into the church with the mission, it would be incredible.
Now
that's what I want.
Now the question is, will Pope Francis let them back in? Because of what he's done to the Anglicans. There's 700 Anglicans who want to come in. They can't come in because he says, well, it doesn't make any difference, So I can see why the SSPX would say, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Okay. Now let's go back to Archbishop Lefebvre and give me some of those other instances where he has gone against Catholic doctrine and, clearly going against Catholic doctrine.
In his writings, he referred to the post-Vatican II church as the conciliar church that didn't have the 4 marks. Now, he got that term from Archbishop Benelli, right? But he began to use that term and weaponize the term by calling the Roman Catholic Church the conciliar church, the Vatican II church. He repeatedly called it a new religion. He said you can no longer find the marks of one holy Catholic and apostolic there, but he actually claimed that the society had the 4 marks, which it doesn't have any of them. I mean, the 4 marks only exist in the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, you're dealing here with dogmatic creedal elements. I mean, that's why this rises to the level of heresy. So the 4 marks, this 2 church heresy, there's the true church and what he calls the conciliar church. And what I've concluded, Robert, is that this, what I might call a blind spot among some traditional Catholics, deals with their understanding of what the church actually is. And that's the study, as you know, right, of ecclesiology, of the nature of the church. What I find in all of the rebuttals to what I'm saying is, you know what? The society is right because they profess the true faith. That's all that matters. Okay.
Yeah, well, you're going right back to the faith versus the hierarchy, the legal structure versus my Christian faith. And like I said, nobody's ever solved that problem. All that's happened is splits. Everybody splits and goes their own way. Do you know of any instance in your study of church history where someone actually said, yeah, we're in heresy, we figured it out, we want to come back into the church, although we're going to have to hold our nose, but we're going to come back into the church? Do you know of any instance that occurred like that?
No, I really don't. I mean, you can go all the way back. I mean, I was studying the Nestorius case today. What happened in Nestorius? He left. There's still Nestorians today in the Eastern Church. You can go through church history, the Fratricelli, the Jacobites, on and on and on. The old Catholics after Vatican I, the sects that have sprung since Vatican II, including Sedevacantists, none of them come back.
Yeah,
none of them come back.
Well, so give me a couple of more things from Archbishop Lefebvre's arsenal of wrong doctrines.
Well, he certainly believed and practiced the position that the clergy, and specifically as bishops, do not have to be one in government with the church to be Catholic. Well, when we say the church is one holy Catholic apostolic, Oneness means being one in government with the church. It's certainly faith and worship, but what's most distinguishable, again, from our Protestant friends is the fact that we are one in government. Again, that hierarchy, Christ, the Pope, the bishops, the clergy, and us in subjection to them. Lefebvre rejected that in principle because he said, we are the Catholic Church, even though we're not one in government with her. And what you'll find, Robert, when you talk to society priests, people need to be aware. They oftentimes will profess the faith correctly. Not always, but sometimes they will make a proper profession by saying, for example, we agree the church is visible and hierarchical and there's ordinary jurisdiction in the church. Okay, they have to do that. Protestants wouldn't do that, but the society people would. And yet, as I've said, there's this breach between their speculative intellect, which professes the truth, and their practical intellect, which actually then doesn't carry out what they profess to believe.
Surely
they say that
somebody in the SSPX that could level with you, John. I just can't believe that they all walk around like zombies and just say, yeah, we believe there's a church, but we're going to be our own church. I just can't believe that everybody would do that. There must be somebody who can.
They have one word, Robert: necessity. This is their rebuttal. They say that necessity, the state of the church and the crisis in the church, justifies us operating outside of the juridical structure of the church, not being members of the Roman Catholic Church, and not having a canonical mission from the Catholic Church.
Okay, so
that's the argument. And frankly, superficially, it was the argument that I bought into while I was attending their Sunday masses. Again, superficially, I thought, you know what? I know there's a crisis in the church. I see what's going down the street at the Novus Ordo Mass. I see what some of these modernist priests are saying. I know there's a crisis in the church. So necessity must be all that's needed for them to carry on. But it's more than that, because as I said, we're dealing with a divine law. Necessity is never an argument that can circumvent the divine law, because as you well know, the divine law foresees all things. The divine positive law of Jesus Christ has already taken all this into consideration. That's why the ultimate answer, even though we say this is murky, it really isn't. The ultimate answer is, am I subject to my bishop? Am I under his jurisdiction? That's the answer.
Yeah. Let's go back a couple of steps and deal again with this issue of my faith versus my hierarchy. And one thing I want to ask is, from your opinion, is it the case that we or the SSPX or the conservative people in general who know what's going on, they see all the crap going on and they try to live with it as best they can. But is it the case, do you think, that Jesus has such a high tolerance for crap going on in his own church that we don't? You know what I'm trying to say? Is that because I've often told people, I says, well, Jesus will take care of it when he thinks he's good and ready to do it. As the Bible said, God waits till the iniquity reaches the full, and then he comes in punishment. It could be that toleration level that God has in his long suffering, let's say, or maybe just putting up with it for the time being. Whatever God's motivation is, the fact is he's putting up with it. And I said to him, look, if God puts up with it, we're going to have to put up with it because we're not better than God. As a matter of fact, we should be modeling ourselves after him and having patience with this. I know it's hard, but the fact is that's what God's leading us to do. What do you think about that?
I agree. When I read what the saints have said, they've said that when you talk about God permitting things, one of the worst punishments he can permit is having evil clerics have jurisdiction over the faithful. That's when it's a sign of God's wrath upon and judgment upon his people, that he is so fed up with the sins. And which one of us can say we're without it, right? Which one of us can say that, we have a right to the beauty and glory of the Catholic Church? We, in a sense, because of our sins, deserve some of this persecution. I mean, that's how I'm looking at it. And I think we have to suffer it. But, St. John Eudes comes to mind. He said, when God permits evil clerics, he doesn't tell you jump ship and set up your own church. He says, weather the storm, because that's the test that God's giving. I do believe this Traditionis Custodes, which is highly problematic, of course. I believe this is an ultimate test that Christ is putting to the faithful. Are we going to react unlike the saints and disobey the bishops and have that 62 missal at all costs, whether it's in a basement or whether it's celebrated by a priest who is celebrating it illicitly? Is that what we're going to do? Or are we going to put our confidence in God and holiness and sanctity and obedience and have God pull us out of this, since he's in charge, as long as we are obedient, okay, to the authority and the commands that are within the scope of the authorities, bishops, submit to this unjust persecution, weather the storm, whether that's going to get us closer to our Lord. I think it is. I think it is.
I also told him, I said, you know what? I think the SSPX needs to go back and read the Old Testament. I mean, page after page after page of just outright sin in God's face, and God's coming to them with the prophets and saying, repent. You look at the kings that they had, the northern tribes had 20 kings. Every one of them had an evil epitaph.
Right.
So-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord. Judah and Benjamin had 20 kings. 3 of them were considered good, and even one of them had sinned. That was David.
David, I mean, yeah, right. Aaron, high priest. I mean, worshiping the calf, he still remained priest, right?
Yeah,
he still remained in the priesthood. So no, you're right, and you know the Old Testament better than me. But that is a blueprint. I mean, that is a blueprint for how leaders have conducted themselves, what God has tolerated, and how He still kept the kingdom together. Okay, people weren't jumping ship.
And then God had enough, and He says, "Okay, you're going off into Assyrian captivity," and we never heard of the northern tribes again.
Yes.
Then Benjamin and Judah, you're going into Babylonian
Babylon.
captivity. Yep. And then he gave them a reprieve to go back to Jerusalem for a little while, but they were never the same people that they were before. They had lost their charm and their glory. It was basically over, and we were just hanging on. So he does eventually come in judgment, but we have to wait until that time. And it might get a lot worse. Who knows who the next pope's going to be and what he's going to bring us. So be prepared, people. It could go either way, good, bad, or indifferent. We just don't know. But while we're here, like you're saying, we better obey the rules. Okay. And there are rules to any game. It's not just coming in there for fun. Can you imagine playing a game without rules?
Yeah.
How would you do that? You couldn't. You have to have rules. And the rules stay no matter how corrupt the institution becomes. That's what we have to understand. And our toleration level has to go up a couple of notches in order to understand and tolerate what's going on today. So going back to Archbishop Lefebvre, because I'm still curious about him, because he's a curious character. Because what I heard was the Vatican offered him one bishop that he could consecrate as a compromise, okay? Which to me implies that sooner or later they're going to be consecrating more bishops down the road if they stay in good terms with the Vatican. But now you have one, okay? So we're giving something to you.
Oh, yeah.
And I heard that he said, no, we're not going to do that. I want 4. And unless I have 4, we're going to go our own way. Is that true?
It is true. You can discover this from the correspondence, which, by the way, is published on the Society website. And the problem with that, Robert, is he actually agreed to the one bishop, and it was scheduled for August 15th, 1988. He agreed to it orally and in writing, and the next day reneged on that agreement that he had with the Holy Father because he wanted 3 more 6 weeks earlier on June 30. Where is the necessity there? You see, that, I mean, doesn't seem to be prudential at all. And it wasn't prudent because John Paul II was giving him a bishop. I mean, Lefebvre lived almost 3 more years. He probably would have got another 1 or 2 more. Okay. And I really believe, everybody says Lefebvre, helped save the church. I'm of the opposite opinion. I believe that if he would have obeyed John Paul II, that things would have turned out a lot better. You read Ecclesia de Afflicta and John Paul II, you can tell he's exasperated writing it, saying we've done everything possible. And he disobeyed. He didn't just consecrate without pontifical mandate, which is subject to excommunication, but he did it contrary to the will of the Holy Father and to a canonical warning. Now, what was the necessity of warning 6 weeks earlier? I think it was devastating for the church. And this has only had a ripple effect to this day. I mean, John Paul II said that was a schismatic act, and that anybody who formally adheres to the movement incurs the censure of excommunication. That hasn't changed. Just because the declared excommunications have changed, and just because faculties have been delegated for a couple sacraments, this is still a movement that is illicit, that is not operating with the blessing of the church. You see, they could do incredible good, and I hope and pray that they come back to the church, or to the church that most of them were never in, because that's where they're going to do the most good.
We spoke about the legal aspects as opposed to the faith aspects. In your mind, as much as you know about Archbishop Lefebvre, did he have a good grasp of the legal side of the church, the jurisdictional side, or did he just sort of pick and choose from it when it convenienced him to use, and then forgot about it when it didn't serve his purposes?
That's what I see in my study. I mean, I don't know how I could conclude he had a grasp of even basic ecclesiology when he says jurisdiction is conferred by the people upon the bishops because they're asking for the sacrament. So where does the church teach that? It's contrary to everything the church has ever said. Pius XII, I mean, it says jurisdiction comes from the bishops from the Pope to the bishops. So, I think his intentions were good initially. I think when he founded the society in 1970, it was a wonderful thing. We were going to have traditional seminarians formed. Rome was allowing him to form these young men in the traditional rites of the church. He had it going. He had everything. The problem somewhere, Robert, he snapped between 70 and 74 when he issued this declaration. You may be familiar with it. It's the 1974 declaration where he really put a target on his back, because in that declaration, he said, I oppose the magisterium. I oppose the new mass, the new priesthood, the new catechism, the conciliar church. See, this is what got him in hot water, his opposition to them. It has nothing ultimately to do with the mass. He was allowed to say the mass. His seminarians were allowed to be formed into the old rites. He declared opposition to the magisterium. That's where Paul VI said, wait a minute. We got to end this thing before it gets out of control.
Yeah. In your personal opinion, John, what do you think of the Novus Ordo Missae?
Well, I think the rite is valid. I've studied the Roman rite extensively, Fortescue and Youngman. I mean, you read Youngman's book; it's a voluminous book. I've studied how the rite evolved, and there really wasn't a Roman rite until a few centuries later. But I believe there's a distinction between the substance and the accidents. The substance, right, the metaphysical terminology, the substance of the rite is completely Catholic. I mean, it's the accidents, it's the appearances, it's the way that's been implemented. I believe that is a problem. Implemented even contrary to the Council Fathers, who wanted Gregorian chant to be pride of place, who wanted Latin. There may be some vernacular, but I don't think the way it's been implemented throughout the world is consonant with what the Council Fathers envisioned, and certainly not consonant with the way the Roman rite was celebrated 1,000 years prior. So those are my objections to it, not to the rite itself, which differs from the Society's opinion. The Society and Archbishop Lefebvre himself called the new Mass intrinsically evil.
Yeah.
That's nonsense. I mean, and maybe you've studied it too, Robert. The elements of the Novus Ordo can all be taken from the past, from various centuries, including the prayers of the faithful, the offertory. It's all there. It's all in history. I mean, people think that the 62 Missal is what the apostles said. That's not the case. It's beautiful. Again, I only attend it, but let's be real. in the trad movement, there's been errors on the right. We call them errors of excess. They've gone too far. We all know what the liberal errors on the left are. Those are errors of defect. Universal salvation, all religions are the same, but there are errors of excess. This is where the trads, I think, have made mistakes.
And me and you are in the middle, John. Just kidding, buddy. Let's go back a couple. I have one or two more questions, and then we're going to go to our chat room here and take some questions for you. And then I'm going to give you a chance to get a drink of water.
Okay.
And do whatever you have to do. Take off your tie, by the way, man. Relax.
Get my wife beater on her. I don't wear one.
Okay.
There's my water.
So what's puzzling to me about Lefebvre is, I get your drift. There must have been something going on in his mind, 74, 75, because he signed all the documents of Vatican II. Okay. Yeah. Now, look, somebody might say, well, maybe he didn't really know what he was doing. He didn't know all the ins and outs of the documents. He didn't know how bad it was going to be from the liberals once they got a hold of these documents, blah, 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 blah. All hindsight, of course. But the fact is, he signed them. And if you sign your name to those documents, you're endorsing those documents. And then he did a complete turnaround and basically said, well, no, I don't endorse them anymore. I either made a mistake or whatever. From your personal judgment, is that a sign of an irrational person, or is that the sign of a person who has met some experiences that have changed his mind legitimately? Or how do you assess all that?
Well, you and I have changed our mind on theological positions. So one can't be faulted merely for changing their mind. The question is, what is the basis for the mind change? After all, the things that you and I have changed our mind on certainly were not in regard to an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church and true. The Roman Rite. I mean, what you said about Lefebvre on the council documents is true, but that's also true about the Mass. He celebrated the new Mass. And he has supposedly celebrated it for a couple of years before he then called it evil. It's the same thing with the way he treated John Paul II. He agreed in writing to have that one bishop consecrated on August 15th, and the next day he reneged. So that, to me, is a sign of some instability in the Archbishop's understanding of what was going on. There seems to be a lack of foundation there, and maybe to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he didn't have the best advisors or consultors. I don't know. But ultimately, the actions he took are contrary to what Catholics hold and believe to be true.
Okay, John, before we go to the questions, is there anything else that you would like to talk about in relation to the SSPX, something I've missed or overlooked or whatever? Feel free to mention it now. Because now they're all going to drill you.
I'll take questions. I mean, there's so much more I can say. It's better for me to take questions.
I meant basically, is there anything really important that we left out that somebody might?
Okay.
Because you went through a lot of points in your last interview. And that was a very good interview. All the points were covered. Is there anything we missed out of that is a crucial part of this argument?
No, I will say I'm going to be diving into these issues in great detail. Issues on canonical mission, supply jurisdiction, the Sunday obligation, collegiality, sacramental intention. I'm going to be getting into the errors of Archbishop Lefebvre in detail. And I agree, it's not sufficient for me to simply say he held errors. I'm going to prove that in future interviews. I've already done a lot of that in my articles. But I do want to reiterate, Robert, as a traditional Catholic, I mean, I don't want the destruction of the society. I want them to be part of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I believe in the traditional Mass and the traditional sacraments and traditional theology and their promotion of St. Pius X and all the and Thomas Aquinas and all the wonderful and good things they can do. So I want to be clear about that. There's no axe to grind here. I'm still on friendly terms with some of the priests, and I won't mention who they are, but I'm doing this in charity, but truth can't be separated from charity. It's my heartfelt desire that this issue is resolved. And I feel like it's not just me, but men have been called to express these issues now at this point in history, because we are at a crossroads with Traditionis Custodes. People are about to exit the bark of Peter over the fact that they think they have a divine right to a particular missal in the Latin Church, which is not true.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to say, stay on the ship, weather
Yeah.
the storm, act like the saints. Let's stay in this game, and then we will get through it on God's side.
I don't know if you've ever read Acts 27 or not, but it's about a boat ride Paul took with his friends, his missionary friends. The whole chapter is just about this boat ride. And you can imagine what kind of boat ride it is. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been writing about it. It's about a ship that almost tosses over, that breaks apart, that Paul says to them, stay in the ship or you can't be saved. I mean, language like that.
Yeah.
It's a total allegory of what we're going through now.
Turmoil.
So I recommend that people read that. The other question, I knew there was one more question I forgot, and that is Vatican II. Okay. Vatican II, you cannot fail but to include that in the mix of all this discussion about SSPX and Lefebvre and everybody else. So what is your view of Vatican II? All the problems there may be with it and blah, 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 blah. Take the floor.
Well, the society's problem is principally with the Mass and with Vatican II, and they claim it's a doctrinal crisis, not just a liturgical crisis. So you're probably correct to say the position on the council is important. The difference is, I believe it's a legitimate ecumenical council, and I believe the problems with the council deal with some of the ambiguous statements that could be interpreted either in a heterodox manner or a traditional Catholic manner. Okay. And you and I have had discussions over many years about some of the difficulties I've personally had in reconciling some statements, for example, in Dignitatis Humanae with some of the other traditional teaching of the church. But I do not hold the position that the council positively taught error, much less heresy. And yet this is the position of the society. Again, this is an error of excess. If you watch what the society says about the council, they claim it teaches heresy, but they never prove that most grave allegation. They'll make statements and they'll give summations of some of the documents, but they don't really look at the text themselves. And again, that's an error of excess in my view. This is an ecumenical council. You know, when you understand the teaching authority of the church, this is part of the profession of faith, and perhaps the society's lack of understanding of how to categorize Vatican II deals with the fact that the Society of St. Pius X has rejected the Catholic profession of faith of John Paul II, 1989. You and I have talked about this a few months ago. They reject the profession of faith because they claim that the profession requires unconditional assent to Vatican II. That is not what the profession of faith says. The profession of faith of 1989 says that there are two categories of infallible teaching. The first category is when the church proposes something as divinely revealed. That's infallible and it must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. The second category of infallible teaching is when the church proposes something to be definitively held. Even though it's not saying it was divinely revealed, it's still to be definitively held. Ordinatio sacerdotalis, the ban on women priests, for example, fall into that. It is a definitive, infallible judgment. It does require supernatural faith as well because it's infallible. God is the witness to that testimony. The third category, and this is what the society rejects, the third category of the profession simply states that one must have religious submission or religious deference to the authentic magisterium, even if it teaches non-definitively, right? So the magisterium teaches in a non-definitive way, which means it's not infallible. It doesn't necessarily bind us, but still we must give it religious submission. We must give it the presumption of truth, okay? Because it's coming authentically from the magisterium of Jesus Christ. Now, a religious submission is not an act of supernatural faith. Okay, it's not a belief in God revealing or the church teaching infallibly, but it's an act of the authentic magisterium. And so technically, if there is something in a statement that's not definitive, in dignitatis humanae may qualify, nostra aetate, some of these statements about non-Catholic religions. Those aren't definitive teachings. These are statements about other religions and how they view themselves. If we find something problematic in those statements, we can have questions. We can debate those issues. We can even suspend our judgment. Canonists have said that because the assent of religious submission is conditional. It's not unconditional like an assent of faith. And I think this is where the society gets everything wrong, because they reject that. They put the council in the first or second bucket and say that they have to submit to all its teachings, but that's not true.
And that was meant to save them from situations just like they're in.
Absolutely
basically.
right. Yes.
So it's
That's
like they're cutting off their nose to spite their face.
It's they're out. Even the council father said, hey, these non-definitive statements of the magisterium can be debated, and the conditions of the society's reconciliation were to allow them to continue to debate non-definitive statements. They're allowed to do that because that's part of the profession, which they reject, unfortunately.
John, I wish we had more time to talk about Vatican II. We could probably go on for another hour on that, as you well know. And that's one of my favorite subjects, by the way. But we want to give our patrons here some deference, and so we're going to go ask some questions now. And John, my cursor is missing again. John, are you still there?
I'm here, Robert.
No, not John Salza. John.
Okay.
John, is he still there? My producer. Okay, let's deal with it. He put some questions up here for us, John Salza. So we'll ask a question for John. If you argue that the SSPX isn't schism, do you agree that Canon 844, Section 2, governs the case of lay people requesting sacraments from them? Do you need to look up that canon, John? Or
no, I know that one by heart, Robert. Okay. 844 sub 2 does not apply to the Society of St. Pius X because they're not considered Catholic churches in whose sacraments are valid. Canon 842 only addresses the Eastern Orthodox, and that's been confirmed by the Holy See, by the Ecumenical Directory, etc. So 844.2 does nothing for the society position. 844.2 governs sacramental sharing, when a Catholic can receive a sacrament in a non-Catholic church. That can happen only when a Catholic, and there are many conditions, they can't just do this willy-nilly, there are many conditions that have to be evident, primarily necessity, but it has to be in an Orthodox church, okay? And then 844.3 actually deals with the people, the non-Catholics to whom Catholic ministers can minister to. So 844.2 is one of the canons that the society has misunderstood. It does not apply to the society because Society of St. Pius X is not a Catholic church in that definition.
I want to interject here because Patricia Parsons says you wouldn't have the TLM if it weren't for Archbishop Lefebvre. Your response to that, John?
Well, I totally disagree. As I said, I think if the Archbishop obeyed John Paul II, we'd be in a lot better spot. And I can say that that position's more consonant with the entire tradition of the church. Obedience never saves, or disobedience never saves the church. It's always obedience that ends up saving the church. And I can tell you in Milwaukee, where I live, there are about a half a dozen priests here after the Novus Ordo was promulgated who continued to say the traditional Mass. And that's because, as Benedict XVI said, it was never abrogated. They had nothing to do with the Society of St. Pius X. In fact, all 6 of them opposed the society, but they continued to say the old Mass. Many of them are still alive today. So no, that's all speculation, right? You can't make an argument based upon speculation, and a contingency that did or didn't occur.
I'm just wondering if in 74, 75, when he didn't radically change his mind, and obeyed the termination of the society, and then in 88, when they offered him one bishop, just imagine what would have happened if he took that compromise, took one bishop, and John Paul II didn't feel a threat from him now. and would say, and as gracious as he was at times, said, okay, you can have your Latin Mass, and I'll make sure it sticks. Just like Benedict did when he got in, you know, he did. I mean, I can't, but when you're at odds with your own Pope and you do things directly contrary to what he just told you not to do, what do you expect? You know?
Right.
I mean, they're lucky they had the Latin Mass for all this time because the
Yeah.
Pope could have come down hard on them.
Right.
Okay. And fortunately, Francis is a man of some compassion, as you well know, even though doctrinally he might be a little fuzzy here and there, but he's got compassion. And that compassion saved the SSPX members and their confessions and their Mass for as long as Francis says so. Okay.
It doesn't help when Francis makes this incredible act of mercy and delegating faculties, and the society comes out and say thanks, but we didn't need the delegation because we have supply jurisdiction. I mean, that doesn't help the situation. And
Yeah.
you see, this is, if you read Traditionis Custodes, what is Francis saying there? He says you can understand his suspicion about those who attend the TLM. Not all of them, but the problem is that the TLM has been unjustly associated with the types of people that foment schism and disobedience in the church. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it's perceived. And again, obviously that doesn't apply to everybody, but when he issued the document, at first I was really angered when I read the document because he said, Pope Benedict lifted the restrictions. He said the Mass was never abrogated, and 13 years have passed, and the gaps have widened and the divisions have increased. And I got angry when I read that, but then I thought to myself, I can understand what the Holy Father is saying. It's not the Novus Ordo Catholics, that we used to call them, that are accusing us trads of being in a new religion and in a false sect and in a different church. It's the trads. It's my brothers in the traditional movement who say those Novus Ordo people, man, they're in the conciliar church. They're in the Bergoglian church. We may be accused of having extreme positions, right? But the left doesn't accuse us of not being Catholics. The right has accused those who don't attend the TLM as not even being authentic Catholics. This is what Francis is talking about in Traditionis Custodes. He says that tradition has been abandoned for this false notion of who's in the true church. So, as I said in prior interviews, unfortunately, some have used the TLM and weaponized it as a banner for this movement, and that's unfortunate. And I hope we don't pay the ultimate price for that, because many of us, I want to say we don't deserve that. But I can see a little bit of the rationale, or at least the suspicion.
Good, John. Okay, John, my producer, just put up another question for you. Questions. Are battlefield masses valid? What is a battlefield mass? John, do you know?
Yeah, people are saying I had to. Well, what I meant is that a Mass has to be celebrated in a Catholic church. What I meant by that is that the Mass has to be celebrated in a Catholic church that is one who's subject to his bishop.
Yeah.
I mean, if a priest has permission to celebrate Mass outside of the physical confines of the church, he can so do it. There have been Masses set on the battlefield. There have been Masses set outside, a visible church structure. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, though, that that's the normative way, but the ultimate way is that a Catholic church is one who is in communion with the local bishop in Rome. And that's what the commentaries to the canon say.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. The bishop is going to give the priest the authority to go to the battlefield to say a Mass. I mean,
Correct.
obviously, the priest has to get the authority from the bishop to go there.
Of
So,
course.
yeah.
Of course.
All right, next question. Question for John. Did Archbishop Lefebvre ever have second thoughts about his actions? How close was he to repenting, assuming he didn't?
I'm not certain about that, although I've heard a story where he may have been on his deathbed and questioned whether he went too far. I've heard that story, and I only hope that's the case and that there was the grace of repentance. It's clearly problematic, to say the least, when you die under a censure of excommunication that's been declared. That presumes that you've committed the moral offense and have been severed from the life of grace, from the church. And so, God forbid that he died in that state. I don't know, so I can't speak definitively to that, but that would be my hope.
John, let me ask you a personal question. Let's say he did. Do you think God would have mercy on him?
Of course, God will have mercy on anybody who repents. Absolutely,
No,
100%.
I'm saying let's say he didn't repent on his
Oh,
deathbed. Would
well,
God have mercy?
if he were guilty of the mortal sin of schism and died in that state, then no.
Okay. All right. So John's going by the book on that one. Okay. Question: is the Novus Ordo not the instrument, though valid, in which they are leading the church into apostasy? You just give a quick answer to that one, John.
I would have a lot to say about that, but what do you mean? The Novus Ordo masses that I've at least seen are full of faithful Catholics. They have adoration, they have confessions, they have masses. I mean, the apostasy doesn't come from the Novus Ordo, right? It comes from those who've been led astray by error. That's the difference.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is Nina, who asked the question. This is the church. This is the mass that the official church has established. Okay, so there's no way that it can be leading us into apostasy. That is a spin, if you will, of those who prefer the TLM to such a point where they can't see any validity of the Novus Ordo. That's where the apostasy is. Okay. That's where the error is. If you want both the TLM and the Novus Ordo, fine, we can both live together. And that's what we're going to have to do. But
Yeah.
once you start pointing to the other side and saying you're invalid, that means the church that put them in place is invalid, which is probably what a lot of SSPX people want to go to say that the hierarchy is invalid. And that's why we can be what we want to be today out of necessity. So
and that's because, as I said, they have a false ecclesiology. The society has a Protestant ecclesiology, and that ecclesiology is that those who profess the true faith are Catholics, without regard to whether the clergy are part of the Catholic Church or sent by the Catholic Church. It's those who profess the true faith, and they don't even profess the true faith. They reject the profession of faith. You see, that is not the ecclesiology of the church. That's the same ecclesiology, Robert, as you well know, of the Protestants. And you can read during the Protestant revolt how they all said, we have the true faith. Rome has apostatized. Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, they all said the same thing. We have the true faith. The true faith exists in the hearts of true believers, those who profess the true faith, without regard to the jurisdiction of the church or the hierarchy of the church. This is what they effectively hold. Even though they may not profess it, in practice, it's what they believe.
Yeah. Let me give you an example. Say we have a family and we have a boy next door who's lost his parents, and he comes over to our house for dinner every night, and we take care of him, and we treat him like one of our own. Okay. But as much as we love him and treat him as one of our own, is he one of our own? No. He's the boy next door. And until, if and when we adopt him into our family legally and come under that structure, he is not our son. And we are limited in how we can approach him even. Okay. So what I'm trying to get across is you have to have both the legal and the heart. And if you don't have both, you don't have anything. You have to have both.
And Robert, when you say legal, we're talking about divine law. As a matter of divine law, you can't exercise authority over that boy because he's not your son. You see, it's not just civil law that you're talking about, but there's a divine ordinance there that's at play. It's the same thing here. Priests without canonical mission, without that being sent as Christ sends the apostles, as a matter of divine law, they cannot exercise the ministry.
Right. As much as they want to do it, as much as they crave to do it, they can't.
And as well as they could do it, right? As well as you might be a better father than the guy's parents or whoever that is, but that's not relevant.
Yeah.
That's not the way it's set up.
Man. And you got to accept life as it comes to you. And there's both. And if you don't have both, you don't have anything. So, John, next question. John, would you say the SSPX is leading people to the logical conclusion of Sedevacantism or to the Orthodox Church if the SSPX is correct?
It's funny, Father Cicada, the late Father Cicada, who I had a lot of battles with, would always say, that traditional Catholics are all sedevacantists. They just don't know it yet. And there's a little bit of truth to that insofar as the sedevacantist position is almost more consistent than the society's position, because the sedevacantists will profess a belief in the primacy. They'll say, yeah, Christ established the primacy. We just don't have anybody occupying the chair. Well, the society says, yes, there's a primacy, and yes, we have somebody occupying the chair, but we don't have to obey him. You see? There again, it's a disconnect between the speculative and the practical intellect, and to that, at least to that extent, sedevacantists are more consistent.
It reminds me of a little story about Rudolf Bultmann. You ever heard of Rudolf Bultmann,
No.
the liberal German theologian? Well, he did a lot of work on the Gospel of John, and he comes to, he's totally outside the Catholic Church. You never even thought of joining. And they said, well, Rudolph, what do you think of John chapter 6 about, Jesus says, eat my flesh and all that? He goes, oh, yeah. He's talking exactly about eating his flesh. He's talking about the Eucharist there. That's it. That's what he's teaching. Well, how come? Well, why don't you, accept that then? Well, because I don't believe John wrote it.
Wow.
What's
Wow.
his excuse? You see? So you see. Anyway.
He wrote chapters 5 and 7. He just didn't write 6, huh?
No, he doesn't believe John wrote any of the Gospels.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
John's name. He's probably one of the most famous German exegetes that we have ever had in the 20th century. And to come out, I mean, he was one of these guys who was just as honest as he could be with what he believed. He didn't care what you thought about him. He just said it, So,
wow.
Anyway,
well, that's similar. He's thrown the authority out, right? And not just the product of the authority, but the authority itself. It's very analogous.
Yeah. All right, John. Next question. When are we going to start the weekly Salza and show?
I think I know Gage.
I'll tell you what, John. How about if we have you back about every 2 months or so? How'd that be?
That's fine. Sure.
Okay, cool. And
we can talk about our Italian recipes. How about that? That'll be the next show.
Yeah, that's true. Oh boy, that would be a show. We've had a lot of people ask about Italian recipes on this show.
Really?
Yeah, because they know.
You and I discovered that our ancestry is from the same town in Italy, in the Abruzzi area. Isn't that something?
Yeah, Abruzzi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm an Italian citizen now.
I know you are, and I've got to get mine because I speak the language and I qualify.
Yeah.
Because of my grandparents, I just got to get that.
Yeah, you got to get that. Yeah, you never know when you're going to need it today.
Okay.
Okay. So I answered that question maybe about every 2 months. John and I will have a different topic, and we'll go to it. Okay. Next question, John. Where in Vatican II did it say to change all the sacraments, change the rites, point towards the people, etc.? The old rite has 3 exorcisms. The new one, how can it be as efficacious? You can handle that, John.
Well, sure. Well, first of all, Vatican II didn't say change all the sacraments, but actually read Pius XII's Mediator Dei. Read from paragraph 46 to 63, somewhere in there. You know what Pius XII said? It said the Pope can change effectively anything with respect to the liturgy or the Mass other than what's been divinely revealed, which is effectively the words of consecration. That's how much authority the Pope and the Church has over the sacraments. So there's no issue with changing the accidental elements of the sacraments. Everything that hasn't been revealed, the Church has authority for. I mean, the Church even has given us the matter and form for sacraments of ordination. And these things have changed over the years, both in the East and the West. So again, when they look at the council saying, well, changing the rites, this has happened all the time. I mean, this is well settled Catholic doctrine. Pius XII specifically says that the popes can and should change the rites to update for the times and circumstances. So there's no issue there unless you're going to take issue with Pius XII.
John, theoretically, tell me if you agree with this. Any pope could gut the Mass of all the prayers prior to the consecration and after the consecration, and we'd still have a valid Mass.
We still have a valid Mass. Yeah. You might need the offertory. I don't know, but, and it would be totally imprudent, but of course you'd still have a valid Mass.
Okay, great. Point made. All right, next question, John. So what are we supposed to do if Francis stops all the TLM Masses and he makes everyone go to Novus Ordo Mass, or worse, worship Pachamama in Amazonian rite?
Yeah.
So a little humor there for you, John.
You see the rhetoric there. Robert and I are very passionate Italians, and yet, I have to say, you got to divorce your emotions from this topic a little bit. You gotta step back. I find the Pachamama incident repugnant. Okay, completely objectionable. Robert and I have both written about Assisi. I mean, we were living at that time. There's so many problems we could talk about, but okay, there's a distinction between celebrating a legitimate rite of the church and pagan worship. How are the two connected, please? Can you help me understand that? The Pope's not going to order us to engage in pagan worship, and if he does, we don't obey it because it's outside the scope of his authority and it's contrary to divine law. But if the Pope does stop all traditional masses, God forbid he does that, is it within the scope of his authority? I think so. We all have a right, and Robert, you can give me your opinion on this. We all have a duty to save our souls, and we have a right to the means necessary to save our souls. But we don't have a right to a particular missal. There's not any divine law that says we have a right to the 62 missal. Again, even that's all I attend. I mean, even Ecclesia Dei has said this, right? So there has to be distinctions made here between what we have a right to and what we need to save our souls.
Yeah. God is a God who's open to people who are sincere, who want to worship him with all their heart, mind, and soul. Even if you had, like me and John just talked about a few seconds ago, you just had the consecration formula and that's it. That would be enough for God. If that's what the situation was, that's what God would accept. Because he's not a God who's going to sit there and count, well, how many prayers did they say? How many hours did they kneel on their knees? How many times did they look at the Blessed Virgin Mary statue? All this kind of, that's all external stuff. Okay. So our Catholic faith is much more than that. So you could take it all away and I would still have my Catholic faith, because it's the God behind it that makes the Catholic faith what it is. And that's who we go to. Okay. And, so prepare yourself. If we do have a Pope that takes it away, he takes it away. Find some other way to worship God. I'm sure he will accept it. Believe me.
Yeah.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to say here. I forget what it was. So let's go on to the next question.
Sure.
I probably mean, do you or John? Do you or John, one of the topics not mentioned because of time is their stance on canonizations, particularly that of Popes John Paul II and Paul VI. Do you have anything to say on this?
Well, I certainly think it's possible that they're in heaven and hope they are. I mean, so if a canonization means that they're in heaven, then they're in heaven. Pastor Terranus defined the scope of the Pope's infallibility, and the Church has never declared that the canonizations are infallible. That is my position. That is the position of St. Thomas. They're presumed to be correct, but I don't get too worked up about it because I look at how the Church has defined infallibility, and at least right now, declaring a saint is not a statement that is part of the deposit of faith, which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, protected by infallibility. I submit to what the Church says on the matter. I personally have questions about whether legal processes were followed and whether, these men lived a life of heroic virtue. but I don't doubt and hope that they're in heaven. If that's what canonizations mean, then may God's will be done there.
I'll give my 2 cents on this, which is if canonizations aren't infallible, obviously, then the mistakes could be made. I think the first mistakes that were made was John Paul II, although he had the authority to do this. It was very imprudent for him to do it, which was to dissolve the devil's advocate. Okay. And now we're down to what? One miracle. And then the miracles that are accepted as miracles are sometimes very frivolous because you really can't prove whether they were genuine miracles or not. So the thing has been diluted, and that troubles me. And then it troubles me that John Paul II had declared more people saints than all previous popes before him. Okay, that's troubling. So now you've diluted the idea of what a saint is. A saint to me is important because you pray to those saints for divine favors. Okay, that's the distinction. Because somebody would say, well, a saint's just somebody who goes to heaven. That's a little bit more than that. If you can pray to that saint and you can't pray to somebody else who you think may be in heaven because the church hasn't declared them a saint, there is a distinction there. Okay, and we have to respect that. But as I said at the beginning, since it's not infallible, and I know some friends of mine who think it's infallible, but I've always challenged them to show me where the document is, and they never do, of course, because there is none. So if that's the case, then we may have some mistakes. I mean, it's possible. I'm not going to say whether there is or isn't because I frankly don't know. I'm just saying it's possible. And if I want to withhold saying prayers to John Paul II because I have some reservation that this may be one of the mistakes, I can do that as a Catholic. Okay, and that's the freedom I have as a Catholic, and the Church gives me that freedom. I don't just assume it myself. The Church allows me to have that freedom. All right, next question. Don't you love the names that these guys give themselves, John? Monsieur Lunchtime. All right. Well, now we got a normal name, Ken McCrae. All right, Ken. Question for John. Doesn't the Novus Ordo Mass change the words of consecration?
In substance, no.
Well, let's explain what we mean by substance then, John.
I mean, to confect the sacrament, the priest has to say, this is my body, this is the chalice of my blood. That's it. And that happens. That happens. Now, if you want to preface it with the word for this is my body, or this is my body which is given up for you, or this is the chalice, which is given up for you or for many. Okay. Those things have changed, but the substance of what is required to affect transubstantiation is simply, this is my body, this is my blood. That hasn't changed, and that can't change because that's how Christ instituted the sacrament.
Now think about this, Ken. For the Church knowingly to change the words of consecration of the Mass, they would know that that is a heresy to do that. So they're not going to do that. Okay, we have to understand, in these things that are dogmatic, the Church is indefectible. If we can't believe that, then just throw the Church away. Okay, I mean, why waste your time with a church that you don't know whether they're going to get the dogma right or not? Okay, especially on something like this that's so important and so dogmatic to our faith. Okay, now other things, we might have problems with, disagreements with, how to iron all these things like the death penalty, for Pete's sake.
Sure.
But this, come on, if we can't get this right, don't be a Catholic. Okay, just don't be Catholic. All right, next question. Is there any truth that Archbishop Lefebvre possibly held the sedevacantist position?
He certainly contemplated it, but he didn't ultimately embrace it, at least in the external forum. Okay. However, It's been said that he tolerated the position to some extent with seminarians. I know there have been cases where he may have expelled some, and that, I wasn't involved in that, or living in the seminary at the time, but I would say no to that. But at the same time, the sedevacantists, the likes of Father Cicada and the 9 who left the society, they claim that they got the sedevacantist idea from Archbishop Lefebvre. Father Cicada released a video a number of years ago saying we got it from Lefebvre. So based
how
upon
do they mean that, John? How do they mean they got it from Lefebvre? Like
they got the idea. They got the idea that Paul VI and John Paul II might not be true popes. They might not be, and maybe it would have. Yeah, maybe it would have to be declared in the future. Now, those sedevacantists ultimately embraced the position that they were never true popes. You don't need a future declaration. I can decide by my own private judgment. But they claim they got the idea from Lefebvre, although Archbishop Lefebvre himself did not hold that position, at least externally. In fairness to him, he did not.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what they meant by, they got the idea from them, because he could have just mentioned it off the cuff, gee, I could have become a sedevacantist, and they could have taken that like, oh, so you're teaching us to become sedevacantist. You never know.
Now, there's even quotes from Archbishop Lefebvre where he objects to that on record, that he objects to the position, that he said that is going too far. So no, you can't say he was a sedevacantist.
Did you ever ask Father Cicada what he meant by that statement?
No, I just refuted it soundly because it's so absurd. He didn't prove it, and so there's no reason to. It's ridiculous.
All right, John, next question from John Diona. Is the Quo Premum Infallible documents to govern TLM? I'm not quite sure what he's.
Yeah, Quo Premum, the declaration of Pious V, in which he codified the Roman Rite, the traditional rite, which, by the way, is not the 62 Missal. Since Quo Premum was issued in 1570 something, the Missal has been updated, and so if what Pius V had declared was the traditional rite of Mass was fixed and irreformable, obviously all the popes after him didn't obey it because they updated it. I mean, they added John to the canon. They did some other things with the prayers and some of the liturgical expressions, etc. So it primarily regulates the liturgical, which is a discipline within the church, a liturgical disciplinary practice, and so. I had one time questioned whether Quo Premum gives us, a right to always have that missal, but I came to the conclusion that couldn't be what it means. Number one, because one pope cannot bind a future pope to anything disciplinary. It's only dogmatic. In principle, that can't happen. And two, the fact of the matter is that missal has been updated over the centuries.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would mention, Robert, is Quo Premum. St. Pius V suppressed ancient liturgical rites. It wasn't just rites that were less than 200 years old. He suppressed, for example, the Gallican Rite. Now, I looked into the Gallican Rite. They trace elements of the Gallican Rite back to Polycarp, St. Polycarp, who was taught by St. John, and then Irenaeus after him. And they said that the Gallican Rite was really a unified rite about the 5th century. Well, that would mean that St. Pius V suppressed, abolished, abrogated a rite that existed for over 1,000 years. Okay, so if St. Pius V can suppress a rite, that tells us, nobody has accused him of doing something completely crazy and non-Catholic. That tells me that the popes have an incredible amount of authority to suppress rights. That's not to say that their actions would be prudent or helpful, but in their realm and scope of authority, they do have a lot of latitude.
You see, what did that guy Jesus say? Whatever you bind or loose shall be bound in heaven. Something like that.
Something like that. Yes, you got that right.
All right, John. Next question. Does John have any recommendations for dealing with relatives who are Masons and think there's no problem with it, and you're overreacting for bringing it up to them?
That's a very difficult question. It all depends on the circumstances. what you have to tell them is if they're Roman Catholics, then the church expressly forbids them from joining a Masonic association. And under John Paul II, Cardinal Ratzinger said that they're in a state of grave sin and can't receive Holy Communion. So start there and see how they react, because that's still the teaching of the church, and it's been the teaching of the church for about 300 years.
Yeah, pretty good teaching. That's never been abrogated.
No.
All right. Ray Mark says, how do you respond to SSPX supporters quoting Pro Primum to negate the new? Well, let's skip that one because we just answered that.
Yeah.
But thanks for your question, Ray. Next question, John. All right, here's one from your buddy. Is the idea that Vatican II is merely a pastoral council an error? Timothy Gordon claims that Vatican II was not the first pastoral council. He claims the trads are wrong, that there was never a pastoral ecumenical council. You have the floor, John.
Well,
read that again, or you got it?
I don't see the question, but I think I heard it correctly. John the 23rd and Paul VI described it as a pastoral council, so I'll take their word for it, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to give it religious submission at a minimum. And to the extent that it is reiterated Catholic dogma and infallible doctrine, it's binding, right? So we know that. So to characterize it as pastoral, people often do that as a justification to just dismiss it completely, but that's not the case. Again, distinctions must be applied to the extent that it's reiterating Catholic teaching, and even to the extent that it's introducing new teaching that is definitive. It must be held with faith. And I will give you one example, Robert. In my opinion, based again on long study, Lumen Gentium's teaching on collegiality is such a teaching that is binding on us. I think it is an authentic development of doctrine on the episcopacy. The Council Fathers at Vatican I had those schemas laid out until Vatican I was interrupted, but effectively what those schemas said and what all the theology manuals said after Vatican I and up to Vatican II was that the episcopacy, which is the Pope in union with all the bishops, is a subject of supreme authority. In other words, when you mention binding and loosing in Matthew 16, you're also aware of Christ saying the same thing in Matthew 18 to the apostolic college. And you know the Greek in the plural, whatever you bind or loose on earth is bound or loosed in heaven. Christ was giving the college of bishops a share in Peter's supreme authority, not his primacy, but his supreme authority. Binding or loosing on earth is universal supreme jurisdiction, with which the College of Bishops share in, being members of the college. This is also a teaching that the Society of St. Pius X rejects. And you know what Cardinal Bio calls this teaching? A most clear and evident dogma of the faith.
Calls what teaching?
The teaching of collegiality, that the College of Bishops in union with the Pope is a subject of supreme authority, not just the Pope alone. The Pope alone is a subject of supreme authority singly by virtue of his office, but the college is also a subject of supreme authority. And that is why the College of Bishops can act as judges in an ecumenical council, right? They're not merely consultors, they participate and share in the Pope's supreme jurisdiction and promulgate doctrine as universal teachers of the church.
Okay, John, let's do this. Pope Paul VI, after he signed the 16 documents, he said that Vatican II doesn't have the note of infallibility. What is your interpretation of that statement?
My interpretation of that statement is that the conciliar text did not meet the definition of infallibility as declared by Vatican I. In other words, Vatican II did not propose any new doctrines that the council said were divinely revealed and part of the deposit of faith. They didn't do that. They reiterated doctrines that have already been declared as dogmas of the faith, right? The divinity of our Lord, the synthesis of our Lady, the seven sacraments, etc. But the council didn't promulgate any new doctrines that they said were part of the deposit of faith. I suspect collegiality may be one of those in the future, but right now we can't say it was proposed as revealed. So there's nothing new that was proposed as revealed, and therefore it wouldn't have a note of infallibility. That would be my answer to that question.
Okay. The reason I asked is because of the qualifier there, the word note.
Mm-hmm.
If you say the Vatican II is not infallible, well, that's a mouthful. But then if you dilute it and you say the note of infallibility, I'm just trying to figure out whether that qualifying word meant something other than saying that Vatican II was not infallible. Did you ever struggle with that at all?
I interpreted note to be something noteworthy or new. It didn't contain a note of infallibility insofar as it didn't advance anything that was not already taught. That's a true statement, right?
Okay.
Other than what's non-definitive. What's non-definitive on ecumenism and religious liberty, one might say some of that stuff wasn't taught before. But in terms of the core dogmas of the faith that were reiterated at the council, those were not new. Those were already. And insofar as those repeat infallible teachings, are they not infallible? Maybe not by virtue of the council, but by virtue in themselves, because they are part of Catholic dogma.
Yes, right. Okay. John says we have one more question. We have 9 minutes to go. So, John, bring that question up. Question: if the SSPX is outside the church, how can the Pope say some of the faculties are valid? I think you've already tackled this,
Yeah,
John.
well, I can answer it. First of all, the Pope didn't say some of the faculties are valid. The Pope delegated faculties for two sacraments, confession and provisionally for marriages with the permission of the bishop. So he's not saying they were valid. He made them. He made them valid because those two sacraments require jurisdiction that the society priests and bishops didn't have. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is the Pope, as the supreme authority in the church, can delegate faculties to whoever he wants. I mean, I suppose he could theoretically put a layman in charge of something that had, required acts of governments. Now, if it requires the priestly character, of course, you need to be ordained. But I'm saying the Pope can work with who he wants to in terms of delegating faculties. And because the society are validly ordained, they are capable of receiving faculties. They don't have them because they're not incarnated, but they are capable of receiving them from a higher authority, and there's no higher authority than the Pope.
Okay, John, somebody asks over here, I just had it, now I lost it. That's what I hate about this thing. It says, has John debated any of the SSPX apologists? Was it recorded, and where can we watch it?
No, but the invitation is open. They have attempted to refute my articles, and so far the debate has been limited to the written word. I have responded in kind. When I did my series on 1 Peter 5, 1 Peter 5 contacted the society to see if any priests would come and join the fray and defend their positions, and that didn't happen. I've got some friends on the other side, and we've had charitable discussions off the record. But if somebody wants to challenge these positions, then I welcome to do so and prove me wrong. I want the truth on this matter. These are the conclusions that I've reached. But I will also say, insofar as the canonical issues are concerned that I researched myself, I went to Rome with those conclusions and got confirmation from people in Rome. And then I appealed to my bishop in writing by submitting a dubia to my bishop, Archbishop Lefebvre of Milwaukee, who happens to be a canon lawyer, and he confirmed my judgments as well. So this isn't something that I'm standing just on my own 2 feet on. I really have done the diligence, and I've taken the steps necessary as any Catholic would by doing the research and then ultimately submitting my judgments to the judgments of my bishop. That's ultimately when I broke from the society, when my bishop confirmed for me, John, the masses do not satisfy the Sunday obligation. That was it.
Wow. Okay, that's about all he has to say. John, here's a question. Where in the traditional church is quote unquote religious liberty defined?
It hasn't been defined. It's been discussed. There's many encyclicals going back to Gregory the 16th and Pius the 9th and Leo the 13th and Pius the 12th. I mean, I've read them all on religious liberty. And then we have Dignitatis Humanae. And Dignitatis Humanae is a bit of a confusing document. I've extended all efforts to try to reconcile with some of the things I've read, and I think it probably can be. The problem I have with Dignitatis Humanae, and Robert knows this better than anybody, I think we had a really intense debate, you and I, on this 15 years ago or so. You know, the notion that man has a right not to be hindered in his public teaching and practice. That's what Dignitatis Humanae number 4 says. And you know, that statement in of itself, if you're talking about a God-given right, that wouldn't be true. But if you're talking about a civil right in a non-Catholic state, that would be true. So I'll stop there. But again, religious liberty is one of those areas that the church has said it's still open for discussion. It's not defined, it's not settled.
Amen. Question for you, John. We've got 4 minutes left. Do you still support the possibility of a pope falling into heresy, and that a serious error or heresy may be possible in a document of the church's magisterium?
I hold the position that a pope could fall into heresy, but he would not lose his office until he were judged by the church. St. Robert Bellarmine teaches very specifically that even though the church has no coercive authority over a pope, it can still determine factually whether a pope is guilty of the crime of heresy. It's called a discretionary judgment. It's not coercive. Nobody can coerce the pope. But after the discretionary judgment establishes the fact of the crime, Bellarmine then goes on to say, and the Jesuits and Dominicans both agree with this, that the pope could be deposed for heresy at that point because he's no longer the pope. By his own heresy, he has severed himself from communion from the church. Some hold that he can never fall into heresy. I believe he can, but we certainly know that it is not a matter of private judgment. It has to be a judgment by the church. The church can make a judgment to provide for its head. So just as the church can elect the man to the papacy, the church can determine who the pope is and whether the pope is a heretic.
Yeah, I have a slightly different opinion on that, and there are like 5 major opinions on this, so
Right.
John understands. My position is that, yeah, like Bellarmine said, you cannot coerce the Pope, but you can determine juridically whether he has committed heresy, which is what they did with Honorius, Pope Honorius.
Right.
But I would say that they can't depose the Pope because they have no authority to do so, no juridical authority to do so. Only another Pope could do that, and that can only be posthumously, of course. Which is what happened to Formosa and the guys back then. So
Yes.
that's where I would have my distinctions with John on that question. All right, John, somebody wants to ask you for summations about one. Can John summarize his conclusions about the SSPX masses? Number 1, merely attending. 2, Sunday obligation. And 3, is it a sin to attend in either 1 or 2?
Okay, great question. This is based on the 8 or so replies from Ecclesia Dei that I have in my article on 1248. So the answers are: 1 cannot attend the society mass to fulfill your Sunday obligation. That's the first point. Number 2, if one attends a mass on Sunday to fulfill the obligation, they commit sin because they're not fulfilling their obligation. Number 3, one who attends a society mass cannot receive Holy Communion. The Ecclesia Dei also said you must abstain from Holy Communion. However, number 4, if you're attending a society mass on a weekday or something, there's no sin there. There's no sin. So that sounds like a bunch of legalese, but I can tell you that all those conclusions come from the Ecclesia Dei replies.
Great. Okay. John, we got a minute to go, so let's say goodbye. And we talked about you coming back in about 6 weeks or so, or 2 months, for another rip-roaring discussion about the Catholic faith and all those things. So you still agree to that for us?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Happy to.
All right, John. So nice to have you with us tonight. It's been a pleasure to talk about this stuff with somebody as knowledgeable as you and has the guts to go along with it. There's, as they said, when they talked about some famous men, there's three ingredients to a real good man, and that's brains, guts, and talent. And you got all three, John. So,
I feel like I'm taking a lot of body shots, but it's okay,
hey, as Nietzsche said,
Oh, please. Oh, please. Stop right there.
I won't say it. Yeah. Okay, buddy. Take
All
care.
right. Thanks.
John, my producer, thank you for all the work you did tonight. And Lawrence Gonzaga, thank you for setting all this up. And to my patrons, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back next week.